Usually the Senate, or often, or always the Senate then has to interview and ask the candidates questions. Goodness, good question. Oops, going back to. I don't know right off the top of my head.
Department secretaries.
Yeah.
What was the question?
Other officers that would be vetted by the Senate.
How did we get the czars?
That's a recent. I think czars are over the last 20 years, kind of a recent development in our government structure. Yes.
So it does apply to, like, department heads, for example, the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. The head of that agency has to be confirmed by the Senate, correct?
I believe so. Yes, and they're vetted. Mm-hmm.
Because there's a big controversy about the person that Obama wanted to appoint to this agency as an anti-gun. And I know I'd emailed McCain, and I actually got an email back from him that said yes, he would vote against that particular nominee. So the Senate must have to pass it.
Also, the head of the Labor Relations Board, that was a pretty contentious appointment. So some of those, they haven't even gone through confirmation. And instead, I think if they're not confirmed, they can be in the office for a year, I believe. And then, I think it's just 1 year. And then at that point, the president either has to select somebody different or they need to be confirmed.
What happened to all those that we confirmed when the time was recessed and he put into offices? I never heard anything about how they got vetted or, and then they're still there.
Yeah, some got vetted, but I believe there is a time limit. We'll need to kind of keep moving along. Senate is kind of interesting. This whole advice and consent. For example, with George Washington, he would go to the Senate, and things like confirmation that we just talked about would require the Senate's approval. But other times when the president goes to the Senate, he might be looking for just some guidance as well. So the Senate kind of plays a dual role as both a legislative branch as well as working with the president in some executive capacities. The anti-federalists were concerned about blended power, which I just mentioned a moment ago, that the Senate would be legislative branch, but also would, not in a big way, but would also work with the president. And the anti-federalists brought that up as that there wasn't a true separation there. And the Federalists then came back and felt that it actually provided for a good balance. That the Senate would have kind of a dual role, whereas the House is just a legislative branch. In the book, it actually talks about the president as being almost like a king-like or monarch-type principle, and the House being more of a democratic principle within our government structure. Monarch kind of referring to the executive power that a king would normally have. Vice President. Vice President has the same requirements as the President does. Oftentimes, the Vice President and the President in our early days of our government were running against one another for those positions. They weren't on the same ticket. The Vice President is President of, serves as President of the Senate, yeah. And so in that capacity, they, for example, will act as a senator when ties occur. And probably the closest analogous position would be like the Lord Chancellor, the Speaker of the House of Lords in England, to the relationship between the Senate and the Vice President. So Whereas the president has more executive roles, the vice president has more legislative roles as being president of the Senate. The vice president also served an important role, especially in our early days as a nation, because people didn't live that long. And so the vice president, his position would be to step in case something happened to the president. The president was no longer able, or died, or was no longer able to fulfill his office. So the president of the Senate also has, it's kind of a similar role as Speaker of the House. But the Speaker of the House can be selected by the House, whereas the President of the Senate is the Vice President of the United States, and so he's not selected. The only way he can be dislodged is through impeachment. The author talks about this, that possibility the founders kind of looked upon the Vice President as kind of a counterweight to the President. Loyal opposition, if you will. So if the president was doing things that were contrary to the republic, that the vice president would be the one that would kind of lead the opposition. That really changed with the 12th Amendment, passage of the 12th Amendment, because at that point, after the 12th Amendment was passed, vice president and the president were running on the same ticket, running together. 12th Amendment, I don't know what the date was on the 12th. Enumerated powers. One thing that Congress would like you to believe is that they don't have enumerated powers. But there are very specific enumerated powers within the Constitution. If you go back, I'm not going to read them all, but if you go back to page 75, I've listed a few of them here. But on page 75, it lists all the different enumerated powers. And they're kind of, some of them, 19 of them are kind of spread out. They're not in one area of the Constitution, so you find them in other locations. Some of the powers, they can lay and collect taxes, duties and imposts, which is an import fee, excises, they can pay debts, provide for contents, so on and so forth.
Wasn't weren't the duties imposed, that was what was really running the government financially?
Prior to taxation.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you're talking about under the Articles. Yeah, some of these grants of powers were actually came from the Articles of Confederation, so they were then blended into the Constitution. So again, here's some of the different ones. Setting the value and coining money. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Weights and measures, patents, intellectual property, dealing with the Indian tribes. They had a number of enumerated powers. So the three ways of restrictions or restraints. There's different ways. For example, interwoven within the grant, there might be a restriction. Added to the grant as a subordinate clause, or sometimes it's located elsewhere within the Constitution. I mentioned on our first night that the Constitution is more of a restraining document than anything else. It talks about enumerated powers, but a majority of the Constitution is really restraining government, especially when you're talking about the Bill of Rights. So when you're talking about a restraint to an enumerated power, so one of the enumerated powers would be to establish postal roads. So it didn't give them the power authority to establish non-postal roads. So that would be an internal limitation to the enumerated power. So another way of restricting government, for example, to raise and support armies, is then followed by the terms, but no appropriation of money so that use shall be longer than 2 years. So oftentimes a power, enumerated power, is also countered with some form of restriction.
On the previous slide, go back.
Yes.
The to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and foreign coin and fix the standard of weights and measures.
Mhm.
That's an enumerated power of Congress. Does that mean the